Some video game franchises come, make a difference, and then go. Resident Evil is not one of those franchises.
Over the last 3 decades, Capcom's survival horror behemoth has continually been reinventing itself in order to stay relevant, and in doing so, has remained one of the biggest franchises in the industry.
With games of all kinds, not to mention other media, it's also got fans of all kinds as well. From those who are purely here for the thrill of shooting zombies, to those who are hungry for every tidbit of information that they can get their hands on.
But aren't you sick of hearing the same old things? You know that Resident Evil was a successor to Sweet Home, you know that Resident Evil 2 got cancelled and restarted during production, and you know that Resident Evil 4's development hell resulted in Devil May Cry.
With nearly 30 years of history tucked into its bandolier of shotgun shells and first aid spray, there are far more interesting stories, secrets and references than the same old tired guff. This is What Culture Gaming, and here are 100 things you never knew about Resident Evil. Probably more than 100, frankly. I couldn't help myself. Regardless, take it away, Josh.
Number 100. Resident Evil 3's missable Outbreak nods. Until the reveal of Resident Evil Requiem, the status and canonicity of Outbreak was hotly debated. Fans would get by nibbling on tiny scraps like those tucked away in Resident Evil 3's 2020 reimagining that are very easy to miss. At one point, players find themselves in the familiar street behind the RPD from the previous title in a satisfying aha moment. However, if you take your time to actually look around, you'll discover a neat reference that makes this area all the sweeter. Approaching an abandoned squad car, a radio cackles to life with a voice that says, RPD dispatch, this is 153. I'm trapped in North Garden with 3 civilians, west side, cafeteria, back of the kitchen. One of us is injured and immobilized. Please advise. Considering there's no other random distress calls like this anywhere else in the game, this has to mean something, and the best guess is that it's a nod to RPD officer and Outbreak character Kevin Ryman. By the sounds of things, he's describing the scenario called Outbreak, where players escape Jay's bar and move across the city. A group of 4 matches perfectly, with Outbreak itself being a 4-player cooperative experience as well. Moreover, just a minute away in Kendo's gun shop, eagle-eyed players may also spot a flyer that reads, Contact Al Lester, the character who becomes the dangerous Axeman in the flashback scenario of Outbreak File 2. So yeah, there you go. See, Resident Evil 3 Remake might not be so bad after all. Number 99, Hunk's theme. A common thread throughout the development of every Resident Evil game is the reusing of assets that were once put to the side. One early example of that comes from the 4th Survivor minigame from Resident Evil 2, where Hunk attempts to escape Raccoon City before its destruction. Compared to the main game, the intent is that it's a much more faster and more focused on action experience. However, weirdly, the music doesn't necessarily reflect that, giving the experience more of a feeling of mystery and intrigue rather than pure Michael Bay spectacle. And that's because these tracks that were used here were actually just unused audio from the original prototype build for the game, known these days quite commonly as Resident Evil 1.5. Just like how the original RPD tracks were used for the marshalling yard in the final game, Hunk's 4th Survivor soundtrack was made of themes that were originally intended for the game's laboratory. Now, personally, I would have repurposed the director's cut music from the mansion basement, but hey, what do I know? I just think that would have fit really nicely. Number 98, the origin of Crimson Heads. It didn't take long for Capcom to want to experiment with Resident Evil. I mean, after all, part of what makes great horror is the element of surprise. And that's why, when returning to the original story in the 2002 remake, Spencer Mansion veterans were thrown off when previously incapacitated zombies started getting back up as Crimson Heads and then chased the player to the closest door. However, running zombies and the idea of running zombies had previously been considered considered for the franchise a little bit earlier. In a developer diary looking back at the history of Resident Evil 0, and especially how it started out life on the N64, game director Koji Oda offhandedly mentioned that they had experimented with enemies being more reactive to gunfire and, of particular note, running zombies. While we don't know if that idea eventually became Crimson Head's exactly, even Oda-san himself mentioned that the concept retroactively does feel like a precursor to them. So perhaps a running zombie of some kind was just always inevitable. Number 97, RE4's calls work in a surprising way. There's nothing quite like breaking a game's camera to find some weird surprises that we were never expected to see. And one great example of that is the call system in the original Resident Evil 4. You've probably never thought about the fact that these aren't pre-rendered and are in fact done in-engine, which of course means that this isn't as flat of an image as it first appears. YouTuber She Says' show Boundary Break revealed a few years ago that the characters involved in these calls do have full character models and are simply placed in a black void with the real call frame then put over top of them. So they actually exist in this weird liminal space. By modding the PC version to move around the camera during these scenes, we can see that Hunnigan, who usually only appears within this small frame, actually has a full character model. Number 96, Walk It Off. One of the earliest moments in Resident Evil 2 Remake sees the player discovering surviving RPD officer Elliot Edward panicking behind a metal shutter. In an impressive display of the grotesquely moist power of the RE engine, Leon or Claire pulls Elliot out to what they think is safety. However, what they're left with is only half of Elliot as he splits in two. However, Japan is quite strict about the kinds of amounts of gore that their games can show off, and so lots of horror titles, including Resident Evil, get multiple different versions. The 0D rating tends to be a little bit more censored than the 0Z version, as games of these ratings usually also require a credit card to purchase as proof of being 18+, but sometimes both versions are hit by cuts regardless, and that's absolutely the case here, when even in the least censored version of the two, the scene is still altered so that Officer Edward comes out in one piece, but ends up dying anyway. That also means that when the player returns later on, instead of zombie Elliot crawling around without any legs, he's actually just risen back to his feet. Nice to see you too, officer. Number 95, that isn't Chris's face. The original box art for Resident Evil outside of Japan is a little weird. Like, really weird. Like, how is this the start of a 30-year-old franchise kind of weird? Ignoring the composited monsters around him and the kind of nonsensical mishmash of gun shapes in his arms, the identity of the central figure has always been a question in the Resident Evil fandom. Most assume that this man, who appears to be pulling two totally different facial expressions at once, is of course Chris Redfield. And since he's the main playable character, why wouldn't he be? Well, interestingly, there is a case to be made that the character is, instead, S.T.A.R.'s Richard Eichen, who starred as the protagonist of the one-off Marvel Resident Evil comic that used this cover art before the game ever did. At the time, the game was using a similar but different artwork after all. What's most interesting, though, is that the man bears a striking resemblance as well to Sylvester Stallone in Judge Dredd, and that the alpha cover is a pretty obvious riff on that character. So, there you go, it's not Chris, it might be Richard, and it's almost definitely Judge Dredd. Did I clear that up? Number 94, a core cast of mutants. Whilst it isn't uncommon to find voice actors from projects that you love also cropping up again together across the industry, it is quite startling that 3 of the 4 key Resident Evil heroes teamed up to fight Magneto in 1992's X-Men the Animated Series, long before they ever set foot in Raccoon City. RE2's Leon and Claire and RE3's Jill all appeared together as Quicksilver, Jubilee, and Jean Grey, respectively, in one of the 90s' most beloved animated series. 2024's revival, X-Men 97, did sadly recast these characters, but wonderfully paid homage to the original team by actually bringing them back in supporting and guest roles. So, whilst Leon's OG voice actor Paul Haddad had sadly passed away in 2020, at the very least Alison Court and Catherine Disher, Claire and Jill, were reunited once more. Number 93, Bullet or Blade. One of the more universally celebrated aspects of the recent Resident Evil remakes has been Leon's characterization, where before his attitude changed quite harshly between RE2 and RE4, the remakes have allowed the Capcom team to write something that feels a little bit more consistent and a little bit more cohesive. And one of the many minor things that ties Resident Evil 4 Remake to Leon's worst first day ever in Raccoon City is his knife. As you probably remember, in RE2, players get their first stabber after they've been saved by wounded senior officer Marvin Branagh. Big Marv then gives Leon his knife and players probably just kind of forget about that interaction. Leon, however, does not. That's because if you inspect the combat knife that players start with in Resident Evil 4 Remake, the description actually reads, quote, "It has been Leon's go-to since receiving it during his time at the RPD," end quote. Ergo, this has to be the same knife that Marvin gave Leon 6 years ago. So basically, if you broke that knife while using it to defend yourself in RE2, well, you kind of just broke the canon, so shame on you. Number 92, Resident Evil Gaiden started off as a Dino crisis. The infamous port of Resident Evil to the Game Boy Color was pretty much always doomed to fail. As impressive as the attempt was, dragging a cinematic for the time, PlayStation game over to an 8-bit handheld was more than a little bold. However, at least Game Boy owners eventually got a little taste of Biohazard in the form of Resident Evil Gaiden. But that almost didn't happen either. In a 2011 Now Gamer interview with some of the team behind the game, sprite artist Curtis Elliott recalled that the game was born from a pitch based off a totally different property. They had previously produced a Dino Crisis handheld game on the request from Capcom and Virgin Interactive, and the higher-ups were pretty impressed with it. So much so that Capcom then elected to cancel HotGen's RE1 port and put M4 on the job of creating Resident Evil's first handheld spin-off. And on a final note, Tim Hull, the game's producer, mentioned in the same interview that M4 had pushed for the game to be released for the Game Boy Advance, even going so far as to create some graphics for the idea, but Capcom sadly wouldn't shift their stance as the game was way too far in development. Number 91, Snoop Dogg. The Resident Evil movies might not be to everyone's tastes, admittedly, but enough people saw them, including myself, that collectively Paul W.S. Anderson's 6 Resi motion pictures have made over $1 billion at the box office. And hey, they kind of had everything. You've got classic characters, you've got bombastic action, and you've got more plot inconsistencies than a gardener drinking on the job. What they didn't have, however, was Snoop Dogg, but that almost, actually, weirdly, wasn't nearly the case. That's because pre-production for the second film, Resident Evil Apocalypse, included a comic relief character by the name Pimp Daddy, who was, according to casting notes anyway, due to be expanded in further rewrites. And the reason for this expansion was that Constantine Film had secured Snoop Dogg to star in this sequel, who of course was at the height of his popularity at this time. However, sadly for the entirety of world culture, Snoop unfortunately had scheduling conflicts due to also signing on to be in the Starsky and Hutch reboot. As such, his character was then given a quick shake-up, given the name LJ, and Mike Epps stepped into the role. And whatever you may think about this film, it is hard to deny that LJ wasn't the most entertaining part of it. I mean, Sai, we've got to do it.
Hit the clip.
Number 90, the movie tie-in game. Staying on the subject of the Resi movies, whilst Capcom never brought Milla Jovovich's Alice into the games, there has at least been minor and major references. The famous laser corridor from the first film has appeared 3 times in the RE series, first in Resident Evil 4, again in the Umbrella Chronicles, and then returning in the Separate Ways DLC of Resi 4's remake. Beyond that, the rogue AI from the same movie, the Red Queen, had its name repurposed for an Umbrella supercomputer whose prime directive was protection of the company's assets from external and internal interference. Whilst the inclusion of these elements might provide an eye roll for people who don't appreciate Anderson's wife insert fanfiction movies, at the very least they've never been adapted into a whole game. There is one Resident Evil film that has though, and that's the 2008 CGI flick Resident Evil Degeneration, which was given a tie-in game for iOS that same year. It's based on the style of RE4 with over-the-shoulder aiming and broken into chapters, and only adapts the first 25 or so minutes of the movie. Of course, being a mobile game, it's very bare bones, but even so, it's a fantastic little oddity in the franchise's long history. Number 89, the Legitimate Randomiser. Resident Evil 2 on Nintendo 64 shows up in a lot of lists of interesting video game ports for good reason. First of all, it's impressive that the team behind the port managed to fit the PS1 game, the FMVs of which were so big for the time that the game necessitated 2 discs, onto a 500 megabyte cartridge. Sure, the game looks and sounds more than a little rough around the edges because of it, but it's still a testament to what was possible at the time. But more than this, the game contains a few unique elements, a series of files that are exclusive to this version, a blood colour change option, and for the only time in series history, an official randomizer. This randomizer swaps around some of the more incidental pickups like herbs and ammo and randomizes the amounts rather than messes with key items, but considering that players can typically only experience these kind of randomizer challenges in Resi thanks to modders, it makes the N64 version quite special indeed. Just don't try and buy a copy now unless you're looking to sell a kidney. Number 88, she's a man killer. Between the 1996 version of Resident Evil and its 2002 remake, several aspects of the lore were changed. Largely, these were things that happened more off-screen, like world-building info. Several BOWs got slightly tweaked backstories, and one of these were the fearsome hunters. In the original game, there was an allusion to Umbrella kidnapping the homeless to use as test subjects. However, as dark as this was, it implied that BOW creation was an exact repeatable science, and that different people would always become viable weapons, which doesn't gel with the idea of framing Umbrella as mad science. In the remake, it's much more interesting and decidedly more disgusting. In an attempt to make more animal-based weapons, but with increased intelligence, William Birkin decided that DNA splicing was needed. As such, Umbrella infected a pregnant woman's embryo with the T-virus as well as reptilian DNA. She gave birth to the first hunter, which was female by the way, and this was then mass-produced. So to recap, every Hunter Alpha that stalks the Spencer Mansion is cloned from one born from a human woman, and all of them are female. So the next time one takes your head clean off, at least you know which gendered swear words to use, I suppose?
Number 87, RE7's cut area. The development of Resident Evil 7 represented many great challenges for Capcom, being that it was not only their first mainline Resident Evil game in first person, but it was the tip of the spear for modern day virtual reality, and the first game on a new engine. Alpha footage for the game shows the team getting to grips with how to develop with all of these things taken into account, including early tests on Unity before the RE engine was finalised. Live action test footage even exists of the famous dining scene acted out by the dev team to get a feel for how it would be seen from the player's perspective. A brief window into a cut area of the Baker estate can also be found, which is that of a cornfield. From the footage, it appears that this may have been where Zoe's caravan was originally placed, but for whatever reason it was removed from the game.
Whilst RE7's location was pretty much perfect how it was, the idea of being chased through the fields by a mad rambling Jack Baker does seem like it could have been kind of horrifying. In a good way. Number 86, the S.T.A.R.S outfit. For an elite group of military men and women, the Raccoon City Special Tactics and Rescue Service sure do dress funny. Despite being a unified squad, they are surprisingly not uniformed. Of course, this is for design purposes. 12 soldiers in different colour-coded gear is a lot more interesting and easy to differentiate on the PS1's blockier graphics than a dozen character models all in the same fatigues. That said, the lore of Resident Evil does love to drop in little morsels for nerdy fans to chew on that explain little inconsistencies, such as why Chris is wearing a totally different S.T.A.R.S uniform when he sets off to Rockfort Island in Code Veronica. Apparently, during the 2 years that the team existed, they had been trialling prototype uniforms and body armor, and this green and black getup was the latest. So, presumably swiping it from the RPD before leaving for Europe, Chris wears this new uniform to honor his fallen comrades. Who knows, this gear might have been approved as the official S.T.A.R.S outfit had the mansion incident not occurred. Number 85, the Genesis of Genesis. The Genesis scanner is a key gameplay feature of Resident Evil Revelations, which tries to emphasize the slower pace by allowing the player to scan rooms for secrets. Perhaps more importantly, they can scan enemies for research points. In the final game, it's a handheld device, which means players have to put away their firearm to scan any incoming threat if they want to gain enough points to earn a green herb. However, at one point in development, it was a darn sight easier to use. According to a sketch from the Biohazard Revelations art book, the device, labelled as Hyperscanner rather than its final name, was a pair of goggles. Additionally, an unfinished model for this version of the device is in the game's files. Whilst the goggles definitely make practical sense, it was likely changed in order to amp up the horror aspect of the title. Number 84, Leon's Got Style. One minor but unfortunate difference between Resident Evil 4 Remake and the reimaginings of 2 and 3 is the inability to change costume on the fly. Alternative outfits are as big a part of this game as any other, with various unlockable looks as well as those a part of paid DLC, but there was an unexpected change. RE4R players had to back out of the game to the main menu if they wanted to switch up Leon and Ashley's get-ups. As with many modders, Aaron Link sought to give players a quality of life tweak by inserting the costume change option back into the pause menu as it had been in previous games. However, in doing so, he made an amazing discovery. Changing costumes in this way unlock unique voice lines with the characters complementing each other's dress sense. Ashley will remark, "Leon's got style," for example. It's a real cute bit of back and forth between them, which sadly got cut when the option was removed, but for whatever reason, Capcom left the voice clips in the game's source code. It just took a modder to connect the dots to bring them back to life. Number 83, RE3's hospital was nearly totally different. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis remains a unique proposition because despite its name, and thanks to its story taking place over several days, it's actually set both before and after RE2 at different points. This is why it started off life with the title Resident Evil 1.9. However, with development being an ever-changing beast, the game was promoted to a mainline title. Kazuhiro Aoyama stated in an interview with CrimsonHead.com that because the game began life as a spin-off, they had a lower budget, which meant the dev team had to be resourceful and could only afford a certain level of scope. Importantly, however, Aoyama-san went on to say, "In the beginning, Raccoon City Hospital was just where vaccines were stored and wasn't even considered as a stage. Resident Evil 3 changing to a main title with the extra development time and resources allowed us to expand it." Whilst the hospital section isn't exactly all that sprawling in the original game, this is a really interesting tidbit since it's the one time players get to take control of the game's secondary character, Carlos. Additionally, the hospital was one of the bigger parts of the game's 2020 reimagining, so it's wild to think that it was due to be so much less originally. Number 82, Hunk's face. Despite wearing a gas mask most of the time, Hunk's face isn't exactly a mystery. It's appeared a few times, although mostly in strange places. The most obvious, and certainly the one that you could most likely call canon, is the unlockable epilogue from Resident Evil 3 Nemesis that features Hunk aboard a helicopter. However, it's a very dark, small and pixelated image, and it can only be seen in-game by beating RE3 8 times. A conflicting look at Hunk's face lurks in the files of Resident Evil Outbreak File 2. Infamously, there was a lot of cut content and unfinished ideas in the game, and a scenario that featured Hunk was amongst them. Players with a Game Shark managed to unearth 2 different Hunk character models, one with and one without the helmet, showing a similar but certainly much greyer looking man. The most interesting, bizarre, and certainly most extensive look at Hunk, however, comes from the Resident Evil toy line from Moby Dick, where the USS Soldier was given a removable mask, revealing his face to the world. What a strange choice. Then again, the Moby Dick figures had several strange but rather neat choices, including a figure based on Rebecca's N64 Resident Evil 0 look, complete with beret, which would eventually be redesigned by the time the game finally arrived on the GameCube. Number 81, the Face of Fear. Lisa Trevor is at once one of the most tragic and also scariest creatures in Resident Evil. An unstoppable monster that lurks the grounds of the Spencer Mansion, she has a history of peeling the faces off of her victims and wearing them as a mask. As such, it's hard to get a read on what she actually is or looks like. Capcom did an incredible job with her design, considering it's just a robe and a mass of flesh. It's easy to miss, in fact, that she has an eyeball on her back. This is an allusion to William Birkin and the fact that her body is used for the creation of the G-Virus. But it gets worse. So much worse.
As it turns out, there's something even more unsettling underneath what we see. RE Remake modders got into the game's character models and discovered that under Lisa's mask is a fully textured face, totally deformed and completely creepy. Not even realizing that she bears a striking resemblance to medieval Sir Daniel Fortescue stops it from being horrifying.
That's all from me. Take it away, Scott Redfield. I mean Tailford.
Number 80, Resident Evil Director's Cut Secret Cheat. There's a lot of weird and wonderful unlocks in Resident Evil, but it's not been a franchise that has ever had much in the way of cheats in it. However, there is one tucked away in the Director's Cut re-release of the original game. On the title screen, start by selecting the Arrange mode of the game, which is essentially a remixed version of the Spencer Mansion with items in different locations, and then move down to Advanced difficulty. Then simply hold the right D-pad button and eventually the text will turn green to signify the double item mode is enabled. The cheat doubles pickups in the game, meaning you'll get twice the ammo and ink ribbons as you explore the mansion. It's a surprising addition, but considering it only works on the hardest difficulty, it's not exactly like it breaks the game. Number 79, Dead Rising Wii is basically a Resident Evil 4 clone. Most Resident Evil games during the 2000s ran on their own unique engines. It wasn't until RE5 that Capcom started using a uniform tool in the form of the MT Frameworks engine. However, the original MT Framework build was unoptimized for the Wii, so when the company elected to port Dead Rising from the Xbox 360 over to Nintendo's hardware, they had to find another approach. Luckily for them, there was a solution in that they had previously released Resident Evil 4 on the console, and for what it's worth, to great success, far outselling the GameCube original. Thus, it was decided that Dead Rising would be built from the ground up for the Wii in RE4's frame. So if you've ever played Dead Rising Chop Till You Drop, it feels immediately familiar because it plays exactly like Resident Evil 4. This includes elements that the game had and Dead Rising didn't: ammo count, a merchant, a full inventory screen, and a suite of weapons that are just dragged and dropped from RE4. Seriously, Frank can wield Leon's signature handgun Matilda, but can't take photographs in this version. It's a weird one for both Resident Evil and Dead Rising fans combined. Number 78, Chris Redfield once punched a young colleague. Resident Evil lore is deep and weird, and there's lots of important questions that are answered off screen. For example, what happened to the S.T.A.R.S Alpha team after Resident Evil 1? This story is largely told in files across the following games, as well as supplemental material. Jill's diary in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis gives us our clearest picture. With the RPD under Umbrella control thanks to Police Chief Irons taking bribes, the team decides to investigate the pharmaceutical giant themselves. Barry leaves for Canada to settle his family somewhere remote, whilst Chris plans a trip to the company's European headquarters. In order to slip away undetected, Chris decides to get himself suspended by bumping into a colleague who is holding coffee and using it as an excuse to punch him. Poor Elran. From the boys' crime department, Chris Redfield is a man who later punches boulders into oblivion, so this can't have been very much fun. Number 77, Meg from Dead by Daylight is in Resident Evil. Well, sort of. In Resident Evil Village, as players enter the main hall of Castle Dimitrescu for the first time, there's a blood-curdling scream heard echoing down the other side of the building. Ethan and players both react with fright. Dead by Daylight fans, however, reacted with glee the first time they heard this. That's because this is a reference to Meg from Dead by Daylight, and this exact scream sample comes from that game's opening FMV. DBD superfans took to the internet to speculate about the two franchises crossing over, and sure enough, just a month after Village's release, Behavior Interactive dropped the first reveal trailer for the Resident Evil Evil chapter of their 4v1 horror game. Surprisingly, it didn't feature anything from the new Resi and was purely throwback content, but it was a fun tease for the future collaboration that remains in the game. Number 76, Resident Evil's most iconic zombie was Unplanned. The first fright that a player gets in Resident Evil is discovering your teammate Kenneth being chowed down by a member of the living dead. The turnaround zombie, as it's most commonly known, is an iconic Resident Evil moment, which has been replicated multiple times. However, the exact design of this particular enemy wasn't in the original documents and came about by happenstance. In an interview with CrimsonHead.com, enemy texture designer Ryoji Shimogama revealed that some of RE1's cutscenes had been outsourced, including the one called Zombie 3. When he received it, Shimogama-san was shocked to find that the artists hadn't followed the design doc, and being that cutscenes were far harder to change than character models, the team were forced to create this particular zombie. He said, "Reluctantly, we created Lightbulb Zombie, which then appeared in the game from the Capcom side. Zombie 3 was called Lightbulb Zombie by the texture team because the head resembles a light bulb. The zombie also got the additional internal nicknames Mr. Peruke after a certain type of Japanese fluorescent light bulb, and Taz, short for turnaround zombie." Number 75, Taz's surprising voice actor. Whilst we're on the subject of Resident Evil's most famous zombie, it's generally believed that Shinji Mikami is the man behind the moan. Developers of the original game have long since confirmed that they portrayed the hapless victims of the T-virus in the first Biohazard, which would have been a lot easier and a lot cheaper than hiring actors. If one was to dig into the files of the PC port of the game, it's possible to see each piece of audio's file name with zombie noises marked as Z_Micah01, for example, representing, of course, Mikami-san. So next time a Resident Evil 1 zombie takes a bite out of your neck, consider the fact that it might be the game's director. Number 74, Resident Evil 2's Remodelling Gun. In February 2019, Capcom released a series of roundtable discussion videos following the release of Resident Evil 2 Remake, which saw the game's team bonding over dinner and discussing the project in detail. There's lots of development tidbits across the videos, but perhaps the most visually striking is the concept inventory for the game. Taking a leaf out of the PlayStation 1 playbook, the game features a familiar navy blue design and pixelated icons for each item in Leon's possession. Considering this is purely concept art rather than a functional UI, it makes various assumptions about the game, separating Leon's knife and lighter and flash grenades into separate parts of his inventory. The biggest curiosity, however, is the appearance of a remodeling gun. The graphic is almost certainly a placeholder showing Jill's STI Eagle from RE3, but the item itself has remained a mystery since. Fans have theorized it had some impact on upgrading parts or was a mistranslation and referred to a gun that itself had been repaired or put back together. We'll never know, but for diehards it was exciting to see Resident Evil 3's classic purple handgun show up in a random behind-the-scenes video. Number 73, Resident Evil's other unique controller. When it comes to weird controllers, Resident Evil 4's chainsaw contraption ranks right up there. It was awkward and impractical, but the fact it's still remembered today kinda means it was marketing genius. It's surprising that Capcom never tried anything of the sort again. After all, they did make 2 different chainsaws depending on what system you owned, so it seemed like they were really interested in pursuing the idea further. That said, there is another weird Resident Evil controller released before all that happened. Tied to the release of RE2, the rather boringly named Resident Evil pad was supposedly designed with the existing Biohazard games in mind. Aim and run are rather appropriately given the most space on the controller, and each handle is modeled differently, one a handgun and one a knife. It's a true oddity not just in Resident Evil history, but in peripheral history. Number 72, that might not be Carlos's face. The Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service are an interesting bunch. One of Umbrella's private armies, the UBCS, are a ragtag group of war criminals from all over the globe. In order to conscript folks willing to do whatever they're told, the company offered death row inmates a chance to live by working for the team. This, of course, had the additional benefit of making them very easily expendable, since they were expected to be dead anyway. In fact, part of the process of joining the UBCS was the abandonment of your previous citizenship, identity, and in some cases, your entire old face. In order to hide known war criminals in their ranks, there was talk of Umbrella paying for plastic surgery. To be fair, Carlos Oliveira in particular is so handsome, and he knows it, that it might make some amount of sense. Number 71, the sales juggernaut is slain. Tracking historical video game sales numbers can be a tricky business. As of 2024, the biggest Resident Evil release sales-wise is RE2 Remake, with an impressive 15.4 million copies. Considering how great the game is, you might not be surprised by that, but it succeeded where so many failed along the way. Resident Evil 5 was a huge deal for the series, being the game that followed the critical darling RE4, the first multi-platform mainline title, and as such the first Resident Evil on Xbox, and also the first numbered title to contain full co-op. Ergo, it sold very well across the PlayStation 3 and 360 and sits at a mighty 9 million units. However, the game also got a re-release on PS4 and Xbox One, which is considered a separate SKU, a stock-keeping unit by Capcom, and therefore its number is tracked differently. This re-release did very well too, going on to sell a further 4 million units. These combined kept RE5 at the top of Resident Evil sales data for 15 years. That's a hell of a record to keep, especially for a game that rarely ranks amongst most people's favorites. And with all that, and nobody watching this right now will know how many times I messed up my lines, I'm passing it back to Sai.
Number 70, Umbrella Corp's Platinum Trophy is the rarest RE achievement. If we're doing 100 facts about Resident Evil, we better make sure we cover every entry, which does include Umbrella Corp, unfortunately. One of the most despised entries in the series, and frankly one of the most embarrassing games ever made, Umbrella Corp was Capcom's half-assed attempt at pursuing the Call of Duty esports crowd. So in that sense, it might not be surprising to learn that Umbrella Corp has the lowest trophy completion of any game in the series, coming in at a stonking 0.4% of all people who played the game on PS4, dragging themselves through it to get the platinum. This is in large part down to the You Can't Touch This trophy, also marked as 0.4%, which is unlocked by essentially checking off an absurd laundry list of objectives called U-Trials. Thousands of kills in specific ways, hundreds with different weapons, playing a certain number of matches, and raising your player level all the way up to 60 to name just a few. This might be doable if the game was any good, but since it's not and there's no one online to play with, this is a slog that makes Gears of War's seriously achievements look like a walk in the park. Number 69, Resident Evil 2's Soda signage. Resident Evil loves America, and what's more American than a cold, refreshing can of Coca-Cola? Ding! There's a trademark symbol. Editor me, put a trademark symbol. It doesn't matter where you go in the world, you can track down a taste of that sweet caramelized sugar. I've been contractually obligated here to say that other soda brands are available. And this isn't necessarily not true of Raccoon City, which at one point had a very obvious play on the famous fizzy drink in its pre-rendered backgrounds. In the standard NTSC release of the game, there's a vending machine on the second floor of the RPD with the words "Cool Soda" splashed across in a very familiar font on top of a very suspect background. This also appears in the city streets when playing a B playthrough. However, these images were both removed in the international releases and on the further DualShock version re-release. Whether Coca-Cola threatened Capcom or if the company just decided to play it safe, we may never know. But considering the Choca-Cola sign still spotted on a couple of vending machines elsewhere in the precinct, it might be the latter. At least they won't ever go thirsty thanks to that sweet Choca-Cola taste. Trademark symbol again. Number 68, the one-off protagonist who isn't a one-off. Resident Evil contains a rotating cast of characters. That is to say, Chris Redfield and Leon S. Kennedy are in everything, and occasionally we get to see Claire and Jill. Jokes aside, there's a bevy of one-off heroes in the vast Resi canon. One of these is the star of PS2 spin-off Resident Evil Dead Aim, Bruce McGivern. A member of the government agency US Stratcom and the owner of the universe's weirdest neck, McGivern is sent onto an Umbrella-owned ship to take down the megalomaniacal terrorist Morpheus D. Duval. Because it was a spin-off and because it wasn't very good, Bruce has never been seen in RE since. However, he's made two unexpected appearances in Capcom crossovers. The first is 2005's Namco Cross Capcom, where he joins a roster of heroes from Tekken, Street Fighter, Klonoa, and Mega Man. Dead Aim's Bruce and Fong Ling, strangely, are the only Resident Evil characters in the title, so they really stick out compared to the likes of Ryu and Jin. However, Bruce had a surprising triumphant return in 2019 with the Capcom crossover card battler, Teppen. This game reaches deep into the history of many Capcom franchises, often letting characters cross paths that never would, and showing some pretty fantastic events in its wonderful artwork. For example, it's the only piece of Capcom released media that's ever shown Wesker extracting T. Veronica from Steve Burnside's body at the end of Code Veronica. It's also got Bruce, which isn't quite as cool, but it's certainly surprising. Number 67, welcome to Raccoon City's Cut Tyrant. Being an attempt at a much more faithful cinematic adaptation of Resident Resident Evil compared to Anderson's 6 prior films, Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City is worth watching once just for the odd winks and nods. Some of these are very obvious, and a lot of the film tries hard to be an adaptation of the 2019 RE2 remake specifically, but there's also a few more clever ones. Sherry Birkin has a nightmare that she describes about a green-skinned monster with yellow eyes, which is a description fitting of the Hunter Alpha. There's a poster advertising the first aid spray in the background of the orphanage. Chris's brown leather jacket and white shirt combo reflects his unlockable costume from the original game. One reference was put together that never made the cut, however, as a fully formed Tyrant head was constructed and left floating in a jar in Birkin's lab. However, the shots that it appeared in didn't make the final edit. It's a shame because it's a fun prop and clearly a labour of love. Hopefully the Tyrant head is bobbing out there somewhere peacefully. Number 66, 9/11 happened in Resident Evil's world. Being that Resident Evil 6 is a breakneck action game, it has little use for some of the franchise's most enduring elements. Notes and diaries don't really make sense to the average player when there's no mystery to be solved except how many bullets does it take to kill the next monster and how many times am I going to have to mash X. Whilst there are files in the menu of RE6, they're largely recaps of prior events. To get in-universe lore, fans had to log on to RENet for expanded versions of the files, which included additional elements. Even then, at least one of these was changed when translated from Japanese to English. The letter from President Benford to Leon that mentions the formation of their US government anti-BOW task force makes reference to the September 11th terrorist attacks in the Japanese version, tying it into the world of Resident Evil. The translation, which we got from Project Umbrella, reads, "The United States has clearly not yet put an end to the long war on terror after 9/11. On the contrary, it was exposed to the new menace of bioterrorism, and recently it's become difficult to confront these through the conventional organized framework." With RE6 releasing 15 years after the event, it seems like an odd choice, but the question of whether RE even takes place in our world has always been up for debate, so perhaps the change was made to keep that distance intact. Then again, the One World Trade Center is visible in Resident Evil Vendetta, so I guess there goes that theory. Number 65, Spencer's surprising first mention. Resident Evil Survivor is a rather awkward, ugly, and deeply flawed video game. As the first spin-off and only the 4th game in the series, it's a rather odd way to close out RE's time on the original PlayStation. That said, there's a lot of great in this game from a story perspective. It shows players the Tyrant production facility on Sheena Island, and gives several updates on events following the original games. The file Report on Destroyed Raccoon City, which is penned by RE3's Nikolai, highlights an Umbrella perspective on the tragedy and also mentions the apparent death of Wesker. However, its biggest piece of info is the mention of Lord Spencer's estate. Despite the Spencer Mansion being named as such since the first game, no mention of a person with that name existed in the games until this point. Sure, there were minor references in supplemental material, but Survivor broke new ground by confirming that the estate was named after a figurehead. This would of course go on to be fleshed out in Zero and Code Veronica as Oswell, the head of Umbrella, who would finally appear on screen in RE5, but his first mention is in, of all things, Resident Evil Survivor. Number 64, Bike Lore. One of Claire Redfield's defining traits is her love of engineering and specifically motorbikes, so when working on Resident Evil 2 Remake, it was important to get it right. Claire's bike is modelled on an existing vehicle of the era, the brand new 1998 Harley-Davidson Night Train. In an interview with Famitsu in the lead up to the game, the staff remarked that they actually worked with Harley-Davidson. The bike manufacturer sent them over reference photos as well as sound samples. It's unknown if the studio's sound team used these sounds directly or produced something that matched it. But that wasn't Capcom's first collaboration with a bike company, as there was a working relationship just before in 2017 between the Resident Evil Vendetta team and Ducati. Towards the climax of the movie, Leon rides a Ducati across a New York highway and then in a moment of hilarious ridiculousness inside of a building. Presumably to maximise screen time. Number 63, The Secret of the License Plates. Back Back to Claire Redfield's bike briefly, there's actually multiple sly references as part of this vehicle depending on where you look. First of all, on the promotional art that features Claire outside the gas station from the beginning of the game, her license plate reads J2198. This is a reference to the Japanese release date of the original RE2, January 21st, 1998. Fun additional fact, fun if you're a nerd I guess, the game released on January 29th in the US, and the remake launched worldwide on January 25th, and this is the date exactly in the middle of Japan's 21st and America's 29th. God, I'm such a geek. But in the game itself, this is actually not what the license plate says. If inspected, it's a not so subtle spelling out of Made in Heaven, the phrase blazed across the back of Claire's jacket. And if you were wondering, Leon gets similar treatment on his Jeep too, with Matilda referring to Leon's signature handgun. Lesson learned, always read a video game license plate.
Number 62, Matilda. But why Matilda?
Leon's personal heckler and koch VP-70 becomes a recurring weapon after its first appearance in Resident Evil 2, earning the nickname Matilda as of RE4. This is partly because this game took a harder turn away from real-world gun names, but if nothing else, Capcom took the opportunity to make one of its many references to cinema with it. Matilda is the name of the female protagonist played by Natalie Portman in her film debut in the 1993 Luc Besson classic, Leon the Professional. The connection, mwah, magnifique.
But it's hardly the only RE gun with references in it. In RE4 alone, there's the Killer 7, which is a shout out to the Capcom game of the same name, and it's also based on the AMT Hardball from 1984's The Terminator. The Remington 870 shotgun also appears in both RE4 and Terminator 2, and the remake of RE4 continues this love of Terminator weapons further by including the Winchester 1887 as the Skull Shaker, a T-800's infamous one-handed shotgun which Leon can flip-cock in the game, just like Arnie used to. Number 61, the true voice of fear. If you've never played a Resident Evil game before, then your first potential scare might hit you before you leave the title screen. When you start the game, a booming voice growls out Resident Evil, or indeed Biohazard if you're in Japan. This man is Ward E. Sexton, an amateur voice actor who had a very interesting day in the Capcom recording booth. Despite the first Resident Evil being a total gamble, someone at the company had the tremendous foresight to have Ward record more than just Resident Evil and Biohazard, but also the numbers 1 through 10 in case they were needed for sequels.
And of course they were. Whilst Ward is uncredited the vast majority of the time, it's his voice you'll hear upon starting RE2, RE3, Code Veronica, and Resident Evil 4.
Ward's calls were also used in Japanese a lot longer than in English, as he reads out the title for Remake and Zero, as well as the GameCube ports of RE2 and 3. In English, he was replaced during this period by Joe White, the voice of Chris Redfield, and also Richard Aiken for what it's worth. Such versatility.
Okay, I need to take a little bit of a break, so I'm tagging in the number 1 Leon S. Kennedy fan, Dan Durkin.
Number 60. Ashley the Ass Kicker. One of the many things that Resident Evil 4 introduced into the series was melee attacks beyond just the swing of a knife. Contextual button pushes allow Leon to either roundhouse kick the enemies or, more famously, perform a suplex, crushing Ganardo's skulls into the ground. But he's not the only one that can do this. During the short section where players can take control of her, if Ashley times opening a door correctly and pushes it into an enemy, they'll be stunned, dropping to their knees. And in the GameCube version of the game exclusively, this gives players the button prompt to perform a suplex as Ashley. And sure enough, Ashley impresses us all with her impressive feat of strength as she can lift the cultist overhead and perform the suplex. This was very clearly an oversight by the developers because they didn't foresee players being able to find a way to stun enemies in the first place. But sadly, this was then removed from all subsequent releases. Shame really. Number 59, Double Duty. For whatever reason, Resident Evil Village's voice cast is largely made up of returning actors from Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 3 Remake. Marguerite Baker, Lucas Baker, and Evelyn all share voice actors with village lead Louisa, Fishman Moreau, and the scary doll Angie. Even Jill Valentine's Nicole Tompkins took on the role of one of the Dimitrescu daughters as well. Then we had Neil Newbin, who previously played Nikolai, famously stepped into the boots of Heisenberg, and Carlos actor Jeff Shine took on the mantle of Chris Redfield in this one. That said, it was also very common for actors to pull off double duty across the early games as well, when considerations for voice acting were more minor compared to today. In Resident Evil 2, Gary Crawford provides both the voice of the panicked gun shop owner Kendo, and also the snarling voice of villainy Chief Irons. Another particularly great example of this is in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, where the late great Tony Risotto gave us the iconic roar of S.T.A.R.S for Nemesis. That was a terrible impression, I do apologise. And then he also played the scaredy cat novelist Dario Rosso, who locks himself in the container at the start of the game. Number 58, Resident Evil 7's monsters aren't mold, they're meat. Okay, in universe, yes, they're made of mold. After all, it would be a little bit weird that we call them the molded if they weren't. But in terms of their design, at least one was actually inspired by a Capcom field trip to a meat processing plant. To give full context, Resident Evil 7 and the games that have followed it have used a technique called photogrammetry, which is the practice of snapping multiple photos in real life in quick succession to build a 3D image. That's why the Baker House in Resident Evil 7 looks so realistic and grimy. Capcom have used this technique for many things, including the monster design. In a 2016 Computer Entertainment Developers Conference, the studio mentioned that they had visited a meat plant and shot photos of various different meats to create a monster made of dead animals. Exactly which creature this became in Resident Evil 7 isn't entirely clear, but a photo of the strange bowl of food, in heavy quotation marks, that Ethan is forced to endure at the start of the game at the baker's dinner table exists in reality. This is really interesting and also slightly disturbing to see outside of the context of the game. It's also just really gross, to be fair. Number 57, Leon's original name. Whilst one of the most obvious changes from Resident Evil 1.5 to the final game is clearly the presence of Elza Walker over Claire Redfield. That doesn't mean Leon S. Kennedy was necessarily the first choice for a male counterpart of the game either. Or at the very least, that wasn't the first pick of the name for the character. Early design documents do indeed show that a character who is clearly Leon, but he's given the name of Grant Bittman. As a Resident Evil 4 enjoyer, it's kind of difficult to imagine the Resident Evil series still going strong like decades later on the back of a government agent called Grant. That's no shade on the name Grant, I actually like that name, it's just not as badass as Leon. So in the end, this choice was probably a wise one. Additionally, early concept sketches show Grant with a pet bloodhound. And it's a little bit of a shame that we've never seen this idea come to fruition, but perhaps when Leon retires, maybe after RE9, he could get himself a dog and retire to a beautiful island somewhere with Ada Wong, because God knows he deserves it. Number 56, not just Elza Walker. Okay, but while we're on the subject, what if Elza Walker also wasn't the first Resident Evil 1.5 playable character to be scrapped? Well, again, at least in the naming sense. Originally, Elza Walker's name was down as Rachel Spire. And if that name scratches an itch in your head, it's because Spire is the surname of Forrest, the S.T.A.R.S Bravo team member who players can discover on the balcony of the Spencer Mansion in Resident Evil 1. Whether or not Rachel and Forrest were in fact meant to be related has never been confirmed, but it seems pretty likely, unless someone internally really likes that name and it was just a massive coincidence. You never know. But what makes this particularly ironic, of course, is that Elza Walker was scrapped in the first place because Capcom wanted somebody related to a character from the first game, which is how we ended up with Claire Redfield. Ultimately, I think they made the right choice in the end, even if they took the longest route to get there. Number 55, the most unexpected asset. It's quite a popular piece of trivia that the S.T.A.R.S office in Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 Nemesis features a photo of the cast of Back to the Future. It's almost certainly one of the franchise's loving nods to American cinema. Perhaps a more curious and cheeky reference to American culture in the early Resident Evil games is the inclusion of a Playboy magazine. Found in the Dead Factory of Resident Evil 3 is in fact a real Playboy cover that's been scanned and shrunk down. A little bit of detective work shows that this is issue 36 of the magazine, published in 1989, and it features Kelly Conrad. Why someone would have this specific outdated issue of the magazine is still to be seen. Perhaps Miss Conrad is a local celebrity to Raccoon City, or maybe someone at Capcom just has a long-standing crush. Number 54. The Netflix show had plans for Chris Redfield. Resident Evil has had some interesting live-action adaptations over the years. Some have been middling and some have been god-awful, but none have been hit with such vitriol from the community as the 2022 Netflix Resident Evil series. This one was proclaiming itself as canon, but the show was already fighting a losing battle without the fact that it was painfully generic and awfully scripted. Surprising nobody, it was cancelled after the first season. The critiques of the show even came from internally, as one of the VFX supervisors stated in an interview with First Aid Spray podcast that the show was horribly mismanaged. He then went on to discuss some of the plot details that were supposed to happen in season 2. And surprising no one, there were a lot of ideas in the works. Season 2's opener was due to feature side character Angel, now fully formed as a tyrant, tracking our protagonist to an African wildlife preserve. The episode was due to climax with the tyrant ripping an elephant in half, but the group would then be saved by a rocket launcher wielding Chris Redfield, which is a pretty wild set of words. Maybe it would have been worth a season 2 alone just to see the sequence, but I guess we'll never know. Number 53, Resident Evil loves aliens. If there's one movie franchise that Resident Evil loves most, it might be the Alien franchise. Claire's relationship with Sherry in RE2 feels akin to Ellen Ripley's and Newt's in Aliens, and several monsters in RE4 are clearly inspired by aliens. You have the Verdugo, which kinda looks like a xenomorph, and we have the Plagas, which is very reminiscent of the Facehook. Also, Leon's choice of pistol in Resident Evil 2, the VP-70, is used by the Colonial Marines in Aliens as well. But it's Resident Evil 3 Remake that perhaps goes the hardest on its love of cinema, and as a result becomes a crazy mashup of feeling like a Terminator movie stuffed with a bunch of alien references. There's a movie poster in Resident Evil 3 featuring Skull Stalker adrift in space, which is heavily inspired by the Alien franchise. Another fun one in Resident Evil 3 that's quite easy to miss is early on in the game, as Jill and Brad walk together after the former temporarily escapes nemesis. They pass a coffee shop called Coffee Shop Sigourney. And if you're not convinced that this is a reference to Ripley actor Sigourney Weaver, then the fact that the cafe was established in 1979, the same year that Alien released, should make it pretty clear. Number 52, work smarter. Capcom has a tendency to reuse abandoned ideas in future games if it fits. Lots of abandoned Resident Evil concepts have been revisited in some form over the years. And really, it's hard to be mad about it. If you can make use of time and effort that's already went into something rather than wasting it, then why not? But Resident Evil hasn't just reused stuff from previous design sessions, and in fact has taken from pre-existing finished Capcom games. After all, not everything can be as big as Biohazard, so who's going to notice? To that end, as a budget title, it made sense to stock Resident Evil Revelation 2's raid mode with animations from the likes of Lost Planet, particularly in the emotes. Elsewhere, most people don't realize that the mercenary soundtrack from Resident Evil 4 is largely comprised of tracks from the 2003 GameCube commercial flop PN03. The likes of Krauser and Hunk's Mercenaries themes are just random tracks from that game, ripped wholesale and dropped into Resident Evil 4. It's not lazy, it's just working smarter. Number 51, Resident Evil 4's Asset Origins. Developers will do all manner of different things for research and inspiration. And it's quite commonplace for Capcom to send its teams out around the world to see locations for themselves and to take reference photos to get a feel for the atmosphere where the games are going to be set. This has famously happened with the likes of RE7, RE5, and in the case of RE4, the staff spent 11 days in Spain and the UK photographing various different Gothic structures. However, it seems like the team got several ideas from art books, and entire assets too. In 2021, a legal proceeding was brought to Capcom that alleged that the company had used the work of artist Judy A. Jurasek without explicit permission. One such example of this is the cracked glass effect on the game's logo. This was settled out of court in 2022. But it isn't just visual art. Resident Evil 4 also uses pre-existing audio as well. The incredible save theme Serenity sampled David tones to Burble and Pine, which thankfully won't get the company sued because it's royalty free. And what it does mean is that Resident Evil 4 has something in common with Devil May Cry, Silent Hill Origins, the 1997 movie The Cube, and the song by Korn, Tenor a Two-Way, as they all sample the same track.
Number 50, Chris's new face. RE7's direction into photogrammetry pushed Capcom in unique ways, and one of the most surprising was a total redesign for Chris Redfield, who makes a cameo at the end of the game. He was so vastly different in an effort to pursue realism that fans speculated that it was all a ploy, but by the time the DLC chapter Not a Hero concluded, it was clear that this indeed was supposed to be Chris. However, the fan outcry was loud enough that Capcom changed Chris yet again for the next game, trying to find a happy medium between his classic RE6 look and something more realistic. That said, Village also came with RE-verse, an absolutely terrible, shallow multiplayer shooter that was supposed to celebrate 25 years of the series, and largely did so poorly. Hilariously, because it was developed concurrently with Village by a different team, it featured RE7 Chris's face in the beta. By the time of the game's launch, Capcom had swapped the imposter with Redfield's Village look. However, in quite a clever twist, the strange one-off face was an optional cosmetic. To be fair, the very limited cosmetics were the best thing about the game, as they celebrated all different eras of the series, including the maligned RE7 Redfield. But now the servers are shut off, so I guess that bit doesn't matter either. Number 49, Code Veronica is the first RE game with a canon ending. Even if you've only a passing interest in Resident Evil, you won't be surprised to hear that since the remake started, there's been a lot of controversy amongst some hardcore fans about which games truly represent the story. Frankly, Capcom seem to have a pretty fluid interpretation of the Resident Evil plot themselves. This isn't exactly a new thing either. This is more of an open secret, but it's one you might not have realized. The first Resident Evil game to have an actual canonical ending is Code Veronica. In the original RE, the game's ending depends on multiple different factors. Whilst its storyline that Chris, Jill, Barry and Rebecca all make it out of the Spencer mansion, there's never a version of this shown on screen. Chris's game completely omits Barry, and Jill does the same with Rebecca. In RE2, it's never been 100% determined which pair of the game's 4 scenarios, Claire A to Leon B or vice versa, happens, since all of them tie into future events. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis has 3 different endings, and none of them have ever been decreed by Capcom as the actual ending, as the only things that matter are that Jill and Carlos escape the city. Heck, even Survivor features choices that affect the outcome of some of the final events of the game. Therefore, Code Veronica is the first game to be a straight shot with only one ending. It took Capcom 5 times to actually have a game that plays out exactly like it does on screen. Number 48, cost-effective creeps. The Dark Side Chronicles' central story, Operation Javier, is mostly praised as acting as a sort of prequel to RE4 by showing a working relationship between Leon and Krauser. Whilst exploring South America, players are accosted by a strange collection of BOWs. These include a few of Umbrella's least impactful monsters, such as the Plague-Crawler Cockroach and the Hunter Gamma, and look, I love the doofy little frog boys, but they're not exactly threatening, are they? There's a reason for this, of course, and that is simply cash flow and connections. Drug lord villain Javier Hidalgo had previously had dealings with Umbrella, but not trusting them, bought his bioweapons elsewhere on the black market. Hidalgo was a wealthy man, but had his fingers in many pies. His scientific research team, Code Remnants, were only given so much money to build their boss's BOW army. As such, they got cost-effective monsters like those previously mentioned, and those that were largely untested, such as the Jumping Man Spider, the Jabberwock S3, and the Anubis, which which, during the latter days of Umbrella, was actually being eyed up as a potential successor to The Hunter. Number 47, Germany draws the short straw. Due to stringent censorship rules, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, like many other games in the series, is heavily censored in Germany. Zombie bodies disappear upon death, blood is always coloured grey, and there are no headshot animations. Importantly, however, the Operation Mad Jackal Mercenaries game is impossible to beat. The game gives players a timer to reach the end, which can be increased by scoring chains of kills. However, in the German version, you are not awarded any score for kills of, quote, human enemies, only the likes of zombie dogs and drain demos. This makes it very hard to grind for the minigame's rewards, such as the infinite rocket launcher for the main game. This is all due to the country's laws on glorifying violence, and as such, Resident Evil 4 got the same treatment. Worse even, as the German version omitted the mercenaries and assignment aider modes entirely, ergo no Chicago typewriter unlock. And who wants to live in a world where Leon can't wield a Tommy gun? Number 46, Germany's Director's Cut censorship. Included in the 1997 re-release Resident Evil Director's Cut was a demo for the then upcoming Resident Evil 2. Much like how most people bought Crackdown just to play the Halo 3 beta, it was a big selling point of the reissue of the original Resi, which is exactly what makes this entry particularly troublesome. With Germany's tight censorship rules, Capcom decided to forego the demo in that territory because they feared that it would give more of a chance for the German censorship board Unterhaltungssoftware Selbstkontrolle, literally entertainment software self-regulation, to place their targets on RE2 early and ban or censor it before it even had a chance. This all wouldn't be so bad if not for the fact that the box still mentioned the inclusion of the demo that was no longer there. Actually, while we're on the subject, speaking of RE2 box mistakes, the PAL PC version of RE2 must have slipped past Capcom's quality control because it mistakenly refers to Claire Redfield as a reporter. Shame she didn't temp as a proofreader, because goodness knows where that came from.
Number 45, RE2's trial version.
Actually, speaking of the RE2 trial, this is a neat piece of Resident Evil history that's full of really interesting changes from the final game, if you're a total nerd for the sequel. And I am.
The biggest and most obvious is the route to the RPD. The demo starts where the final game does, with players escaping the flaming wreckage into Kendo's gun shop. However, rather than cut through the basketball court and around, the van that blocks the alleyway isn't there, and Leon can simply head straight into the RPD's side gate. Funnily enough, this is similar to the remake opening street section. In the RPD, there's a piece of leftover 1.5 music, a unique item in the precinct key, and missing cutscenes. Additionally, the door with the broken hole in the bottom that Sherry squeezes under is in a slightly different place. The demo also ends with Ada in the S.T.A.R.S office, probably less so an intent of story and more likely an intrigue factor to get players talking about the new character and interested to find out what happens next. Number 44, the floating head.
Okay, fine, but just one last thing on the RE2 demo.
Perhaps the most interesting change takes place in the infamous liquor corridor. After walking past the decapitated body, Leon stops at the ominous pool of blood. As he crouches down to inspect it, a head falls from the ceiling. Instead of the liquor cutscene playing, possibly because it hadn't been finished yet, the creature drops down in front of Leon and control is given back to the player. It's quite startling if you're used to the final product. It's possible that the head drop was removed entirely because decaps in video games are a quick way to more adult ratings, censorship, or even banning in some places. However, that's not to say that the head is totally missing from the final release. By using a camera break mod, fans discovered that the head is still hidden in the ceiling. It's actually where the blood drip is coming from. Now, every time you walk down the liquor corridor, you'll know that the creature's snack is still up there, just out of sight. Number 43, the most famous character. Resident Evil might have 4 major protagonists who have had repeat showings, but there's a one-time guest star who gets all the love. The merchant in RE4 in his gruff, Cockney-ish accent was one of those examples of video game characters that everyone fell in love with instantly. Spawning memes before the word meme was even nomenclature, the merchant became one of the most iconic aspects of Leon's excursion around rural Europe.
What are you buying? Calling the player stranger and that chuckle have become as synonymous with Resident Evil as the likes of the phrase Master of Unlocking. Village's equivalent, the Duke, mentions the Merchant, and RE6 Elephant Killer is also a reference to the man asking Leon if he's going to hunt an elephant with the hand cannon. But many non-RE games also shout out everyone's favourite shopkeep. Characters in the likes of Nier Automata, Ghostwire Tokyo, Lego Brick Tales, League of Legends, Bayonetta, and so on have given some of the Merchant's lines as dialogue. Borderlands 2 features an achievement called What Are You Buying?, whereas Doom Eternal has a store in one level called What You Sellin'. The love for the Merchant runs deep. Number 42, the cancelled comeback. At one point, someone at Capcom really pushed for a return for the Merchant, but in a way that you could never predict. As part of the Biohazard 6 artworks book, there's a page of cancelled concepts for Leon S. Kennedy's unlockable outfits for the game. Nestled amongst some obvious but not bad ideas like Cowboy and Sheriff is a frankly bizarre one of Leon carrying the Merchant on his back. It's totally balmy and the kind of silly that totally suits Resident Evil, but sadly such a thing never came to pass. We've no idea why, but it's entirely possible that it just would have been unfeasible or was too much stress from a rigging perspective. It's a lot of additional work after all for an unlockable costume. Truthfully, it would have absolutely been worth it, but at least we'll always have the concept art. Number 41, Capcom love to reference other franchises. There have been numerous nods to other Capcom classics hidden throughout the Resident Evil series, some blatant and some far less so. Resident Evil Revelations features a vending machine labelled as Trish as a nod to the Devil May Cry character, and similarly the wine bottle in Resident Evil Village might be a Dino Crisis reference considering it's called Regina Rose. In RE7, inspecting the spines of the books across the Baker Plantation will have you come across Fighting Street. This is a not so subtle nod to Street Fighter, which was released on the TurboGrafx CD in 1988 under this name, according to Capcom former producer Yoshiki Okamoto, to avoid paying Namco. Yet Namco seemingly owned and perhaps still owns the name of one of Capcom's biggest IPs. That's probably trivia for a different video though. A lot of them are much more hidden, as in they'll never see this is just for me kind of hidden. Yet fans digging through Outbreak File 2 textures found amongst some pixelated newspapers of all things a very low res image of the Devil May Cry box art. Perhaps the cutest and weirdest though is another one you'll definitely never see. On the texture for one of Chris's models in the Biohazard Trial Edition demo, one cheeky artist drew a little chibi of Capcom's classic mascot platformer Mega Man. That might be the most adorable thing I've ever seen. That's enough from me for now. Up next is Joe Johnston. Has anyone actually seen Joe? Where did he go?
Number 40. Resident Evil was the PlayStation's fastest mega hit. Resident Evil is too big to fail these days. If you were to look at Capcom's Platinum titles, a list of their best sellers, most of the top 10 are Resident Evil games. That wasn't always the case though. And with video game horror being such an unknown entity, RE1 was considered a huge risk. According to Yoshiki Okamoto, Resident Evil wasn't the first, but it was certainly the fastest game to sell 1 million copies at the time. In fact, from its release in the last week of March to the end of the year, RE1 sold 1 million copies in Japan alone, making it the 4th best-selling game of the year, behind Super Mario RPG, Tekken 2, and the original Pokemon. In the US, it also sold 1 million copies by September, after just 6 months of being available. Being a smash hit all around the world, Resident Evil became the best-selling PlayStation game up to that point. By the end of the console's lifespan, Wikipedia tracks Resident Evil as the 17th best-selling game for the system, with over 5 million units shipped, and RE2 sitting a little above in 14th place. Not bad, considering original sales expectations were only in the tens of thousands. Number 39. I have this! With some puzzles in Resident Evil being solved or made clearer by the player examining items in their inventory, it's ingrained in some to inspect every little thing they pick up. It turns out that if you study the magnums across the RE series in particular, you'll find some weird stuff. The magnum found in Resident Evil 0 features, of all things, the unicorn medal from RE2 on it, purely as decoration. Clever reuse of assets, perhaps. Stranger, though, both revolvers that players can pick up in Resident Evil's 2002 remake feature the umbrella crest. In the case of one, this makes sense. It is found in the Spencer Mansion after all. but the other far less so, since it's taken from Barry during the confrontation between him and Jill, and he's seen entering the mansion with it. Maybe you were right to be suspicious of him. And finally, Barry's new Magnum in Revelations 2, and also Resident Evil 5's Mercenaries mode, is a Smith & Wesson 500 for certain, because on close-ups and in the character viewer, it's possible to see the company's logo on it. Number 38. Hidden details in Village. Continuing with studying weapons, Resident Evil Village has a couple of interesting details in and of itself. The M1911 handgun is a commonly occurring firearm in all of media, let alone Resident Evil. But Villages is special in that it makes a rather unexpected nod back to the franchise's past. On the optional grip for the weapon is a crest with the lure of a bee, key item from our remake, for unknown reasons. Additionally, one of the game's most powerful weapons is the custom M1852, known as Wolfsbane. Engraved along the barrel is the Latin phrase Fiat voluntas tua, which in English is "Thy will be done," a phrase taken from the Lord's Prayer that's perhaps fitting for fighting demonic entities. There's also some fun details if you're paying attention to key items too. The item Nicola's Goddess statue in Japan was translated to Father Nicola's Angel in English, which might well be a fun reference to the 2007 comedy Hot Fuzz and Simon Pegg's character DC Nicola's Angel. After all, Simon Pegg did once get so high playing Resident Evil 2 in the TV show Spaced that he thought he was under attack from zombies. Number 37. The first Japanese dub will surprise you. Resident Evil might be a Japanese IP, developed largely by Japanese teams, but it's a franchise that has both of its feet deeply in the USA. Ever since the original game, Biohazard has enthused about its love of American cinema, been largely set in America, and has been developed in a way that makes it attractive on a global scale, not just catering to domestic audiences. But even with all of that aside, it's quite remarkable that the first Resident Evil game to get a Japanese dub wasn't until January 2012's Revelations. The first 15 years of RE was all subbed in Japan with English audio until that point. On top of that, RE6, which released 9 months later in October, shipped in the same state, and Japanese voice acting wasn't added to the game until a DLC update down the line. Number 36. The identity of the Tyrants. People have long speculated about the identity of the Tyrant in Resident Evil, with dozens of wild theories in particular about Nemesis. No, it's not Billy Cohen. This is despite the fact that the backstory isn't left to interpretation. The problem, as is often the case with Resi, is that it's tucked away in various pieces of supplemental material. The issue for Birkin and the Umbrella research team was that the T-virus was far too powerful and unpredictable, and the success rate of Tyrant transformation was said to be 1 in 100 million. However, Umbrella came across a perfect match in Russian super soldier Sergei Vladimir. Best of all, the Soviet Union had already cloned Vladimir for warfare. Umbrella bought Sergei's clones and used them to perfect a strain of T-virus that was more likely to produce positive results. But in terms of actually creating a Tyrant, like the UBCS, Umbrella bought death row inmates who could disappear off the face of the earth without question. 4 criminals were infected with T. 2 died immediately, but 2 survived. One of these men took poorly to the transformation and was disposed of, and this becomes the janky T-001 proto-Tyrant you fight in Resident Evil 0. The T-002, however, bonded with the virus and became the so-called perfect organism. Using data from this experiment, Umbrella immediately began mass production of the creature, so all other Tyrants made by Umbrella, from Mr. X to Nemesis, all started life as this one death row prisoner. His name? Billy Cohen. Not really. Nobody knows that part, and we probably never will. Number 35. Europe takes the L. Do Capcom hate Europe? The only time Biohazard released a game first in the region before the rest of the world, and it was Resident Evil Gaiden of all things, dropping several months before it came to Japan. Well, only. Depends on your distinction. Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica was first available in Japan in 2001 in arcades, complete with a unique cabinet. When it came to home release, not only did Europe get Survivor 2 for the PlayStation 2 before Japan, but America never got it at all. And frankly, to say you're not missing much is an overstatement. Whilst Umbrella Corps is called the worst game in the series the majority of the time, that's simply because it's more well known. Survivor 2 is an ugly, messy, rushed retelling of a classic story with most of that story missing, no voiceover, a short runtime, terrible controls, and the random insertion of Nemesis in a way that makes absolutely no sense and doesn't even feel like the classic monster. So basically, America wasn't missing much. Number 34, We Do It. Whilst the reveal trailer for Resident Evil 2's 2019 remake was pretty exciting stuff, we already knew it was happening for several years thanks to a pretty low-key video posted by Capcom in August of 2015. Producer Yoshiaki Hirobayashi stood in front of a screen with a conceptual logo and excitedly proclaimed in awkward English, "We do it!" answering the decade plus of fan demand. We Do It became a bit of a heartwarming meme amongst excited fans, and so Capcom paid tribute to this in the final game. In the waiting room on the first floor of the RPD, there's a plaque that commemorates the work of the staff, that ends with Hirobayashi-san's phrase. There are a few more nods elsewhere in the game's textures. The Raccoon City streets bring back the Arucus store sign from the original RE2, which is the name of Street Fighter's Sakura backwards. And there's even a flyer advertising the services of photographer Frank East, an Elseworlds version of Dead Rising protagonist Frank West. Has he covered wars? Inquiring minds must know. Number 33, Barry's Wife. Alongside the development of the early games, Capcom also had a contract for a series of novels written by S.D. Perry. Perry has said in multiple interviews that production was hectic, that deadlines were tight, and that she could only work with information provided. As Resident Evil's story evolved from game to game, she often found her books contradicting plot reveals that would happen in the next one, such as mentioning Jill Valentine leaving Raccoon City in her RE2 book, only to have to backtrack on that when Resident Evil 3 was revealed. However, she also broke some new ground that has had an impact on the series. Whilst she's wrongly accredited with the Tyrant's nickname Mr. X, this actually was first used in a third-party strategy guide licensed by Capcom, she was at least the first person to state that Chris and Claire are orphans, which was later canonized in Code Veronica. If you think that's a coincidence, then the next one should win you over. Whilst RE1 mentions Barry Burton's daughters Moira and Polly, it never mentions the man's wife, and so Perry picked the name Kathy for her novelization. Nearly 20 years later, in Revelations 2, Barry's return to the franchise indeed confirmed that his wife is Kathy Burton. Number 32, Boom Goes the Dynamite. Grenades have long been a part of Resident Evil, even if it was originally just as an ammunition type thanks to various grenade launcher weapons, or in the first game, the bazooka. In terms of actual hand grenades, players didn't get to try out small explosives until RE4. That said, there were at least 2 prior attempts to integrate throwables like this into the series. One of the many cuts from Resident Evil 2's 1.5 days, grenades were found in the code of the leaked build of the game, which tracks with RE2's increased focus on action. They were also somewhat functional at this point in development too, as Leon has an animation for rolling one across the ground, and they provide a small explosion. They're also one of the very few Resident Evil weapons which can actively harm the player if you stand too close. While they never made it into the final game, Capcom tried again with Resident Evil 0. Yet again hidden in the files of the trial edition of the game, modders found an icon for a red hand grenade. However, they do nothing whatsoever, and this icon is missing from the final release. Number 31. Who is Ethan Winters? When Capcom had to go back to the drawing board following the disastrous response to RE6, their ideas for a protagonist took shape slowly. Originally, Resident Evil 7's lead was going to be a stand-in for the player and given a generic storyline. Over time, however, they decided it would be far more interesting if Ethan was a central player in the plot, rather than simply reactive. So, when the design team started sketching him out, Ethan was considerably different. Not only do early concepts show his face, something never officially revealed in-game, but some even put him in a suit. Apparently at one point he was set to be a detective. In the final game, Ethan's occupation is never mentioned, but a supplemental guidebook refers to him as a systems engineer. You never really think about it purely because it's a gameplay and design device, but Village's inventory, like RE4's before it, implies that Ethan is carrying around a suitcase. In concept stages, the character was originally drawn with a backpack with different size upgrades that would be made available. This probably would have made more logical sense than a briefcase, but maybe there's bonus points for style. And that's all from me. Back to you, Si.
Number 30. Who is Alice? Alice. Who the... Yeah, okay. Never mind. But no, really, aside from director Paul Anderson's hot wife doing backflips and roundhouse kicks, who is Milla Jovovich's Alice? The RE movie franchise is so painfully obviously put together on the fly that it often contradicts itself and makes random changes all the way through. Alice starts the franchise as an amnesiac Umbrella employee, turns on the company, gains superpowers, loses superpowers, regains superpowers, and the grand reveal at the end is that she's a clone of Umbrella owner Alicia Marcus. Although never said explicitly in the movies, Alice's surname is given in the novelization of the 1st century as Abernathy, except it's also apparently not that either. Early drafts in the 3rd outing, Resident Evil Extinction, saw Alice hack an Umbrella server and discover files that refer to her by the name Janice Prospero. This name is also seen briefly at the end of the 2nd movie, Apocalypse, but it's never referenced back to again. Then again, trying to make sense of these movies is the real Resident Evil. Number 29, Wesker is still alive. Except not in the timeline that you think. Arguably, the video game universe has had a villainous vacuum since the downfall of Umbrella and Wesker, and it's tried multiple times to fill this space. One brazen attempt was Umbrella Corps, a game which around 16 people played, which features files that imply the return of a shady sunglasses-wearing overseer making his way into the ranks of the new Blue Umbrella. Whether or not Capcom goes through with reviving Wesker in the games is one thing, but he's still set up to return in the Anderson-verse. If we ever go back there, please God, no. In Resident Evil, the final chapter, the latest incarnation of Wesker is ultimately killed by a door, yes, seriously, and then presumably vaporized in an ensuing explosion. However, the novelization ends with, and there's no way to say this and not make it sound utterly ludicrous, the sentient blood of Wesker lying in wait miles underground, preparing its revenge on the world. Because this film is apparently not bat poo crazy enough, the book had to add perhaps the most outrageously silly cliffhanger of them all. Number 28, the award for consistency. With 30 years of history, it's not surprising that the likes of Chris Redfield and company have had many different voices over the generations. That said, there are 3 recurring characters who each have an actor with remarkable tenure. The first is William Birkin's TJ Rutolo, who is the 3rd man to take up the mantle of the paranoid scientist. Rutolo first appeared as Birkin in 2009's Darkside Chronicles and has voiced the character ever since. These include appearances in Operation Raccoon City, and perhaps most strikingly, he's one of 2 actors to cross the threshold between pre- and post-remakes when he voiced Birkin again in the 2019 version of Resident Evil 2. He also voiced Frank West, by the way, which is just weird to me. The other one of these actors is Keith Silverstein, who portrayed RE2's Hunk. He's the 3rd man under the gas mask, but his time as Hunk stretches from 2007's Umbrella Chronicles through Darkside Chronicles, Mercenaries 3D, Operation Raccoon City, both the Revelations games, and finally returning once more for RE2R. But the longest serving actor is Sally Saffioti as Ingrid Hunnigan, who appeared way back in 2005's Resident Evil 4 and returned for RE6 and the CGI films Degeneration and Damnation. Even when Hunnigan was recast for RE4's remake, Saffioti got to play her again following this in 2023's Death Island film. Number 27, the Ditman Glitch. Resident Evil is a game series popular with speedrunners, for whilst its initial playthroughs may be slow, steady, and often trepidatious, once a player knows what to expect, it can be extremely satisfying to run a game again and again to beat your best time. As such, fans have discovered plenty of neat tricks to get them through games quicker. The most notable of these is RE4's Ditman Glitch, named after the GameFAQs user who discovered it. When equipping the striker shotgun, if the player aims and then opens the inventory before the laser sight appears, Leon will get a sudden boost of acceleration. All actions are performed at roughly 1.5 times speed until they're interrupted by certain baked-in animations, and Leon's additional speed means it's possible to break outside of the game's intended boundaries, performing massive skips. Whilst the glitch doesn't appear in the 2023 remake, Capcom at least paid homage to it. The game features collectible charms for Leon's attaché case that have different passive effects. One of these increases Leon's run speed by 8%, and it is of course a striker shotgun. Number 26, the ports that never were. The Chronicles games are some of the few Resident Evil spin-offs to receive ports. Whilst the likes of Survivor, Dead Aim and Outbreak are trapped on their original hardware, the Wii on-rail shooters made their way to the PS3 5 years later in 2012 with PlayStation Move functionality. However, apparently they were considered for at least one more port. In an episode of the Complete Global Saturation podcast, industry insider and author of Itchy Tasty, an unofficial history of Resident Evil, Alex Anil, rather unexpectedly made mention that the games were at one point considered for the Nintendo Switch, but it never went ahead. With the Switch being the rare system that still uses motion controls, outside of a mouse pointer PC port, it's one of the few places these games could land with minimal redesign. It's entirely possible that they'll still happen one day, considering that the Switch 2 functions much in the same way as the original console. Number 25, Resident Evil on the Saturn. Resident Evil 4 might be one of the most ported games of all time, but Capcom didn't skimp on getting the original RE into as many hands as possible, following the PlayStation release with a port for the PC, the DS in 2006, and perhaps the most interesting, one for the ill-fated Sega Saturn. Being that the Saturn worked completely differently from the PS1, it had to be built from the ground up. This means the game has a slightly different look, since the system's graphics used a lot more squares as opposed to the PlayStation's triangles. One place where it definitely lacked compared to the PS1 was the ability to render transparency.
It does a decent job with the underground aqua ring, but there's a major difference in one of the game's final areas. The room where players fight the Tyrant is traditionally full of glass tubes filled with green liquid, but in the Saturn version these are smashed to save attempting to render quite a fair bit amount of transparency. Of course, the Saturn port also features a few more additions, a unique hunter variant called the Tick in the caves, as well as a second gold-coloured Tyrant at the end of the game if the player picks Chris at the start. Number 24, the Meaning of Majini. It's fairly common knowledge that the Las Plagas victims in Resident Evil 4 are called the ganado because it's Spanish for cattle, which is a pretty chilling way to refer to an indigenous population that you've come along and turned into your mind-controlled army. Similarly then, the infected in the Kajuju region of Africa in Resident Evil 5 are given a unique name in Majini. This comes from the Swahili word, the native tongue of Kajuju as it turns out, genie from the Arabic jinn, this referring to supernatural, often demonic spirits. Pretty fitting, frankly. Number 23, the Two Redfields.
One of the many things Code Veronica is celebrated for is being the only story in the series where players take control of both Claire and Chris Redfield, and considering they go up against a pair of twisted umbrella siblings, it makes a lot of sense.
However, whilst it doesn't happen very often, it's not the last or indeed first time they are both featured in a game together. The DualShock re-release of Resident Evil 2 and most subsequent ports features a side game called Extreme Battle. A unique Chris Redfield model is actually unlockable for this mode, meaning that Claire and Chris are both technically in RE2. The only other games that both Redfields have appeared in together are unsurprisingly the Dark Side Chronicles, which features a retelling of Code Veronica, and Resident Evil The Mercenaries 3D, which features classic characters across the series battling monsters together in an arcade shooter. An RE-verse, but I just need to not, again, that game doesn't exist anymore technically, so yeah. Number 22, Resistance is a treasure trove of references.
Resident Evil Resistance was a weird one, a 4v1 DBD-like package with Resident Evil 3 Remake, which caught a lot of unnecessary flack for being associated with that game. Additionally, limited support meant that it was destined for a short shelf life.
It's hard to argue that the developers and designers who worked on the game didn't clearly love the series though, as it's littered with fun details that pull from different parts of it. Outbreak gets multiple nods, such as Valerie implied to be the roommate of Yoko and January rising for newspaper News Comet alongside Alyssa Ashcroft. There are various skills and rooms in the game named after legacy characters and legacy items too. The Bemusement Park specifically had a couple of amusing nods to more recent outings. If players take a moment to look at the water around them, they'll find Leon's jacket floating alongside a stuffed alligator, a reference to the gator chase in RE2 Remake. Additionally, one slightly silly one is a poster for a home cleaning service proclaiming mold, bugs, vermin, we do it all, featuring an image of the Baker House from RE7. Number 21, Dee-Ay.
Speaking of which, Operation Raccoon City is also an example of a game which could have been something with its return to famous locations and its promise of what-if scenarios. It certainly didn't help that the game launched with only half of its campaign on the disc. The USS Delta team was fun enough and they were a big part of the marketing, but most people haven't even played half of the game because the US government special agents Echo 6 weren't ready in time for the shipping dates. Of this ragtag group, they're about as interesting as you'd expect, which is to say very mildly. However, there is one particular chap who gets a special shout out. Crispin Jettingham is one of Resident Evil's few openly gay characters. Of course, it never comes up in the game, but there's a clever reference to it staring you in the face the entire time. According to writer Adam Bullied in an interview with Polygon, Crispin's call sign of Dee-Ay isn't just two random letters and is in fact a reference to the US military's once famous approach to sexuality in their ranks: don't ask, don't tell. Dee-Ay, don't ask. It's a really good way to show representation without awkwardly bringing it up in the writing, that's for sure. I'm going to take a little bit of a breather, but getting back up when you thought he was dead like a Crimson Head and running full tilt at it, it's Josh Brown.
All right, guys, look, we've almost made it. We're in the home stretch now, and I think it's time to properly celebrate, isn't it? You know, come on. Admittedly, it's 0%. I mean, I'm on the job, I'm not unprofessional, but here's to you for making it this far. You better stay until number 1. Number 20, Operation Raccoon City's weird Star Wars link. The early 2000s were a weird time for Capcom. They were in the midst of a push to outsource titles in key franchises, despite the failure of 2009's Bionic Commando game developed by Grin. And this resulted in a cancelled Mega Man X project, the despised DMC reboot, and the lukewarm, at best, Operation Raccoon City. The company briefly butted heads with developers Slant 6 Studios, as the latter pitched a remake of Resident Evil 2. Sounds like a good idea to me, guys, that the owners of the IP then shot down. In fact, lots of development files and folders still make reference to this early pitch. Instead, Capcom, though, wanted Slant 6 to do something in the vein of their popular SOCOM series, and thus Operation Raccoon City was born. Perhaps the most bizarre tidbit from this production, though, is that players who dug into the files of the PC version of Operation Raccoon City found loading screens for a proposed Star Wars Battlefront 3. Now, there had been rumors at the time that Slant 6 was going to work on a threequel to that series after Free Radical Design had closed. But nothing ultimately came to pass, obviously. Quite why these wound up in the final version of Operation Raccoon City, though, is anyone's guess. Number 19, Resident Evil originally had ghosts. Unsurprisingly, the original Resident Evil's development went through many changes as the design team tried their hand at pushing horror in gaming forwards. Now, most people know that RE1 had 2 cut characters, one of which was at least partially a cyborg, but we'll get to that in another video, I suppose. But that overall is just the tip of the iceberg. In an archived interview with RE Horror, Shinji Mikami mentioned that the game's earliest drafts had ghosts in them rather than zombies, but he started to muse on the fact that it was just a little bit too generic. He thought other horror games were likely to use ghosts, and he wanted to stand apart from them. Furthermore, he recounted his experience watching the film The Exorcist and the lack of relief that he had from being able to fight back. Mikami-san then wanted to give players an enemy that they would understand, be able to escape from or fight, and then the game would continue until the next encounter. Zombies then were the perfect fit, and at that point in pop culture, I know it's quite shocking to think about now, nobody was actually using them. It was Resident Evil that reignited the flame for the shuffling undead. Number 18, the man who wrote the book. While some of the initial concepts began to take shape fast, the story of Resident Evil came together much later in development. In fact, things wouldn't really click until Kenichi Iwao joined the team. According to the man himself via an interview with CrimsonHead.com, Mikami-san's original story was about a team of soldiers trying to rescue a good scientist from a house full of monsters made by an evil scientist. He also compared the game to Mega Man, which paints an entirely different picture of the overall scenario. Now, whilst Mikami-san is rightfully credited for the game's direction, it was Iwao-san who steered the ship with his writing, inventing the likes of Umbrella and S.T.A.R.S, as well as writing all of the notes and files in the original RE1. Speaking to Gaming More, he also revealed that Wesker's resurrection after his apparent death in RE1 had actually always been the plan, despite him leaving Capcom shortly after Resident Evil's release. Interestingly, he then went to Squaresoft to make Parasite Eve 2 though, so the guy just kept on serving up dubs. Number 17, the man who would be Chris. Being first revealed at E3 2005, Resident Evil 5 still had a long development period before it actually hit store shelves in 2009. In fact, this is the longest time between a first reveal and final release in Resident Evil history. While of course some of the more basic ideas were already down, you know, Chris Redfield in bright sunny Africa, there were a lot of changes made during those nearly 4 years. In 2007, Capcom dropped another trailer though of Chris giving a monologue, which isn't all that dissimilar to the one in the opening of the final game. Except it would eventually be Roger Craig Smith who would read the lines as Chris. In the trailer though, it was Kevin Dorman, who was ultimately recast due to scheduling conflicts with James Cameron's Avatar of all things. However, in an example of life working in very mysterious ways, Dorman did find himself getting a chance to play Chris 10 years later in the CGI film Resident Evil Vendetta. Even though he's still yet to play him in a game, the actor returned to the role in 2023's Death Island movie. So in a funny sort of way, Resident Evil 5 kind of gave us two great Chris Redfields. Number 16, loading screen mayhem. In the mid-90s, Namco got a tip of the hat for being clever enough to put some of their classic arcade games into their big PS1 titles, noticeably Ridge Racer and Tekken, for people to play whilst the real main event booted in the background. It was a good way to entertain players whilst they waited around, and Namco thought it was such a great idea that they actually decided to copyright loading screen minigames. That's why it never became more of a common occurrence, by the way. In 2015, admittedly, this pattern ceased, and it was suddenly something that every developer could do without the fear of legal recompense. However, by then it was just too late to start a trend. A pair of games that did take advantage of this though were the Nintendo Switch ports of Resident Evil Revelations 1 and 2 in 2017. Now Revelations features a Ghost Ship Panic, a simple shooter that uses cute pixelated versions of the game's beasties marching down the screen. Revelations 2's is perhaps the most charming, however, as Ghosts in Homunculi, that's right, is actually a reskin of Capcom classic Ghosts and Goblins featuring Barry in the lead role. It's a shame that we don't have more weird additions like this when games get ported, but hey, at least we'll always have these two experiences. Number 15, Chainsaw Maniac. The Switch Revelations ports weren't the first time Capcom went retro with Resi though, as in order to advertise the PS2 port of Resident Evil 4 in 2005, the company put together a little browser game based on the style of the Game & Watch handhelds from the 1980s. Chainsaw Maniac was seen on advertising banners across the internet, which took you to the cute little spin-off, moving a facsimile of Leon around a village and trying to take down as many of the so-called maniacs as possible. The game also had competitions attached to it, with prizes including a copy of RE4, one of the now sought-after chainsaw controllers, and a very cool unique shirt for Saddler's Saws. Now this really should have been an unlockable in the RE4 remake, but Capcom never asked us for our input, so this goldmine was left untouched. Number 14, Welcome to Raccoon City was hoping for the best. 2021's Welcome to Raccoon City should have been so much better than it was. Under budgeted and running in at just over an hour and a half, it had the unenviable task of telling not just one Resident Evil story, but two concurrently. That is tricky business regardless, but there were other factors at play leading to this decision to adapt so much in such a short amount of time. Director Johannes Roberts has recounted a meeting with Constantine film producer Jeremy Bolt 3 years before the film's release, where he wound up playing Resident Evil 2 Remake, which of course was brand new at the time, whilst he was writing the spec script. This means that the film's concept got approved either before or just in the wake of the release of RE2R, and that might seem like an obvious thing to adapt now, considering just how massive that game became. But at the time, it was quite a risk. Nobody then knew that it would go on to perform as well as it did commercially. Sticking to their guns then probably paid off on that front, as if Resident Evil 2 Remake had failed, they would have found themselves adapting a game that nobody cared about, which is a much harder sell than the already hard sell of Welcome to Raccoon City. If nothing else, the film had the recognizable visuals of the game's Raccoon City Police Department going for it, though it's just a shame that's all it really had going for it. Number 13, secret tattoos. Now, most people know that Billy Cohen's tribal tattoo, when looked at sideways, reads Mother Love. This is another of the series' many references to Queen, alongside Made in Heaven and Let Me Live. But Billy is not the only character with secrets relating to their tattoos. In fact, the secrets here involve characters that you probably didn't expect to have tattoos at all. Now, Jill's partner in Resident Evil Revelations usually has his arms totally covered. However, if you equip what's called his beach outfit, you can see that he has an anchor on his left arm. Now, whilst this might just be part of the cosmetic, I mean, after all, he's wearing his beach outfit, and an anchor seems pretty on the nose as well for a game set at sea. It's also not like it's just a joke costume. Also, the tattoo appears in the concept sketch for the outfit as well. Perhaps the most surprising, though, comes from Resident Evil Village's Moreau. Now, if you inspect the poor little fishman's second form in the character viewer, you can see that he has a traditional mother tattoo. You could, if you wanted to, accuse Moreau of being a little bit basic for having this, but at least he swapped out the classic heart for a jellyfish? Way to be on brand, I suppose. He's got his theme and he's sticking to it. Number 12, David Ford's face. The Steam-forged Resident Evil board games are perfect for Resi fans who also love to play on the tabletop, dripping with attention to detail and a deep love for the franchise overall. For example, the RE2 expansion Retro Pack, which features every card in the game reprinted to look more like the 1998 game, features a card of the Rebecca Chambers basketball outfit, specifically 50 cards into the unshuffled deck. Of course, a nod to the 50 times the player has to search the desk to find the photo in the game. In an episode of the First Aid Spray podcast, though, go listen to it, I wrote that bit, not sigh, lead designer of Resident Evil 3, the board game, Sherwin Matthews, lamented that Capcom actually turned down his request to create an expansion for the game called Beginning of the End. This would have allowed players to play as the UBCS mercenaries and RPD officers during the early days of the Outbreak. And one of these included characters would have been David Ford, an important name for RE loreheads out there, as through various notes across the games that feature the RPD, he tells the story of the downfall of the precinct. Since he only appears in the files as well, nobody knows what David looks like. Hell, I could be David for all you know. But this expansion would have given him both character art and a miniature, meaning the first time Capcom would have ever approved the look of the character. But they didn't approve it, and sadly, it never came to be, though this would have been just so cool. Number 11. Code Veronica is incredibly important. There has always been debate about whether or not Code Veronica should be treated as a spin-off or, despite not falling into the naming convention, a mainline title. Whilst many, wrongfully by the way, believe that it was originally conceptualized as Resident Evil 3, there is still an argument that it deserves that elusive numbered title status. I mean, aside from fleshing out the Umbrella Corporation and bringing Chris and Claire together, it also gave us the T Veronica virus, which would go on to be a huge player in the lore of Resident Evil. The pathogen was extremely harmful to the infected, which is why Alexia Ashford needed to sit in suspended animation for 15 years with it, and why Darkseid's Javier Hidalgo was going to the extreme lengths of replacing the ravaged organs of his infected daughter's body just to keep her alive. That said, it was Resident Evil 6's Carla that made it work. By editing the code and combining it with trace elements of the G virus found in Sherry Birkin's blood, she was able to create the C virus, or chrysalid virus, a mutagenic that allowed rapid transformation with very little drawback. Of course, that all happened in Resident Evil 6 and is very poorly explained on screen. But still, the long and short of it is RE6 actually couldn't happen without Code Veronica, so that actually might give you a reason to not like that game. I'm not doing my job here.
Number 10, you weren't supposed to see this. Adding a little bit of detail can make video games come alive, and sometimes it doesn't really matter what that is. In a pre-HD world, you could write gibberish on your assets and not worry, since nobody was ever going to be able to read them through the hazy standard definition blur. However, what then happens when the games get an HD remaster? Resident Evil's 2002 remake has a few funny bits of text we were never meant to see. The herbicide item reads, amongst other things, "This house is danger." And Code Veronica Yoroshiki ne, which charmingly translates to "Go easy on Code Veronica." Also, inspecting the lighter shows you that it is in fact a lighter of lighter. Whatever that means. Finally, upscaling the backgrounds also means it's easy to see the text on the gravestone in the back courtyard of the mansion, which features Greek text. Translated to Latin characters, this says Capcom, but with Ks. Number 9, Dario Rosso. Resident Evil 3 Remake sometimes speeds along so fast you'd think it had something else it would rather be doing. The intro in particular is infamous for this, turning key moments and characters into blink and miss it cameos. One of these is Dario Rosso, the novelist extraordinaire who locks himself in a storage container in some vain effort to outlast the Outbreak. In the original RE3, he's a man beset by panic, but in the remake that's been changed into paranoia and outright rage. He yells at Jill, climbs into the big tin box and shuts the doors, never to be seen again. However, if you want to get a little more from Dario, there are a couple of small Easter eggs. If you wait around, he and Jill have a few back and forths where he even says one of his legendary lines from the original game. If you shoot at the container with your precious few handgun bullets, he calls out for help. "Stop that, she's trying to kill me, you're going to hear from my lawyer." It might be a little late for lawyers, Dario. Number 8, Wreckage of the Mad Experiment. Resident Evil's usage of old material occasionally also extends to its music. In the case of RE 1.5, as previously established, plenty of the OST got moved around the final version of RE 2. The N64 soundtrack of Resident Evil 0 did indeed get used, even though the shift to a different hardware generation meant remaking most of it, although the save theme for N64 is totally different and well worth a listen. One of the best pieces of Resident Evil music occurs frustratingly in just one room in the original Resident Evil 2, and it's a room that's very easy to miss. If the player uses the fingerprint scanner across both A and B playthroughs, they can enter a room in the lab where the track Wreckage of the Mad Experiment plays, a dark, twisted theme that perfectly represents Umbrella's willingness to laugh in the face of morality for their own goals. So then it was perfect to be reused in the Umbrella Chronicles as the track Live Evil, a rock theme that is heavily associated with Albert Wesker. Another RE2 track that triumphantly returns in future games is Ada's theme, which beautifully plays during Resident Evil 6, which is probably the only time someone has described anything in RE6 as beautiful in any way. Number 7, split screen Outbreak. Resident Evil Outbreak is often described as ahead of its time, considering it was a multiplayer cooperative online Resident Evil game that was stuck on the PS2. Just a few years shy of Microsoft's Xbox Live, online gaming on consoles was barely in its infancy. Moreover, many regions that saw the release of the first Outbreak didn't even have online functionality. It's been a bugbear with the game ever since, and a barrier for entry for those who want to play it as intended, and without having to worry about the really bad AI of your companions. But as it turns out, at one stage, Outbreak was supposed to be completely playable offline. In fact, it would have beaten RE5 to the punch of being the first split-screen Resi if things had gone as planned. There's footage shown in the E3 2002 trailer that shows the flashback scenario being played by 4 survivors on one system. Presumably the feature was cut due to technical limitations and because of the game's budget. Outbreak, being a spin-off, was already working with way less than, say, a Resident Evil 4, which would explain how the massive scope of the game shrank over time. After all, this launch trailer also featured footage of the unreleased A Day in Raccoon scenario that was set in a spooky motel. Number 6, Wide-Eyed. Despite being cutting edge for video games at the time, the live-action footage in Resident Evil has always been hilarious. The faces and voices of all the characters in the game were provided by different people, so Charlie Kraslavsky may not have provided Chris's dialogue, but he brought the characters life in the live-action opening and endings. He dropped a load of incredible information about his very brief time working on the original Biohazard with the late great Philip J. Reed in his book on Resident Evil. There was apparently a disagreement between Capcom staff about whether or not Chris should have stubble, which ultimately landed on a yes, until the team saw Charlie's attempts to grow it and then changed their mind. There's also the tale of Chris's actor leaving the set to roll around in puddles and wet gravel to dirty his white shirt for the game's ending sequence. Perhaps the funniest is that it is, of course, his eye that is used as the title screen for the game. Kraslavsky recalls Japanese men telling him to open his eye wider, wider, and him insisting that it was as wide as it went. In the end, having to pull at the skin with his fingers to make the eye as wide as possible. You'll never look at that title screen the same way again. Number 5, where is Raccoon City? Raccoon City is often described as a small Midwestern town, which is in itself quite funny considering how much it seems to change shape and scope throughout the series. I mean, how many small Midwestern towns have zoos and stadiums? Regardless, Midwest is about as far as Capcom have ever gone as to put it on a map. The S.T. Perry books decided to place it in Pennsylvania, which is particularly funny as that state isn't even a part of the Midwest at all. Still, things have been clearly deliberately left vague. That said, whilst we can't identify where it is, we do at least know some of its inspirations. In his interview with CrimsonHead.com, RE3 director Kazuhiro Aoyama said that the version of Raccoon City he designed for that game drew inspiration from Boston and San Francisco, saying that many American cities have wide, bright and open streets, but the back alleys are dim and depressive and even give a sense of life, for example, San Francisco's Chinatown. Of course, neither Massachusetts nor California are in the Midwest either, but these were purely inspiration. Number 4, Resident Evil 4 on Xbox. Much has been made of the long, winding and messy road to Resident Evil 4, with numerous versions cancelled along the way before Capcom arrived at the game that totally shook up the industry. But even aside from its creative struggles, just finding a home for the title nearly went completely differently. Kevin Backus, head of Xbox third-party relations, once recounted a story of a meeting with Shinji Mikami around Christmas of the year 2000. The rumours were that Mikami-san was frustrated with developing for the PS2. With Microsoft's debut home system on the horizon, Backus saw his chance to coerce Mikami-san to the green side of life. However, the meeting, which all took place in Japanese, fell apart very quickly when the father of Resident Evil asked Backus and his interpreter what Xbox's credo was, and was dissatisfied with the answer. Mikami-san ended the dinner abruptly, and Backus chastised his interpreter for not delivering Xbox's vision of gaming as, quote, considered to be art, much like film, which actually sounds like something Mikami-san would have agreed with. He pursued a second chat with Mikami-san days later, but by this time it was too late, and Capcom had signed a deal with Nintendo, which would of course become the de facto home for Biohazard for the generation, from the remake to RE4. Had this initial meeting gone well, we could have seen a Christmas miracle, And a very different world too. As it stands, the original Xbox is the only home console released since 1996 that never had a Resident Evil game on it. I think. Someone fact check that for me. Number 3, Paracelsus' Sword. The 2020 version of Resident Evil 3 ends with Jill taking a rail cannon into her hands and blasting away Nemesis like a true badass. It's an undeniably cool moment no matter what you A, think of the game, and B, think of the fact that the game ends with a weapon rather immaturely called the finger. Give Nemesis the finger. It's really funny. It's really clever writing. What makes this sting more is that Resident Evil 3 Nemesis' railgun was just so cool. A gigantic machine so big that it was firmly rooted to the ground, players had to guide Nemesis' final metamorphosis into its line of fire. The weapon was also called Paracelsus' Sword, a reference to a famous painting of the Swiss alchemist, astrologist and physician. Paracelsus is credited as the father of toxicology, which is the study of harmful effects of chemicals on the human body. How apropos. Thankfully, it wasn't the last we heard of old Paracel, as Resident Evil Resistance, ironically packaged with RE3 Remake, made a fun nod to the weapon with Oswell E. Spencer's ability, Paracelsus Generator. Number 2, Resident Evil on NES. Resident Evil's infamous abandoned port to Game Boy Color sure is a sight to behold. Even if it was never going to work, it's impressive that someone tried. To a certain extent, that's true of this entry too, which is an honest-to-goodness NES bootleg of the game, and it's surprisingly good. First of all, a little context. China has had a long, complicated history with video games and imported works, and never got the NES back in its heyday. However, that didn't stop people from developing systems that could play NES cartridges and knockoffs as educational hardware, especially since Nintendo's patents on the hardware expired in the mid-2000s. Chinese players who couldn't get their hands on the PlayStation version of Resident Evil, for example, could at least play a bootlegged version that somebody made for the NES. And this thing is impressive. Sure, it only features Jill's playthrough, is missing most of the bosses, and doesn't quite have the same production value, but almost the entirety of the game is here in some form. The mansion is the same, the puzzles are the same, even the enemy layout is the same. The major change is the introduction of the Gaiden battle system rather than simply aiming and shooting from afar, which, with the now giant hallways of the Spencer Mansion, means most enemies can absolutely be run past if you wanted to. This is all to say it would be very few people's preferred way to play the classic Resident Evil, but the NES bootleg is a novelty whose existence is just so weird that it's hard not to love. And number 1, Sweet Home. Did you know that Resident Evil was based on Okay, I'm only kidding. And the real number 1, Sweet Home. Did you know that Resident Evil 7 was based on Sweet Home? I mean, think about it. Spooky haunted house, documentary filmmakers going in at the beginning. It's in first person, like parts of Sweet Home. Okay, fine, I'll do something else. Number 1, Remy. Though largely forgotten in the wake of the actual release, a ghostly lady said to appear in Resident Evil 7's beginning hour demo was a big talking point in the months leading up to the game. Her appearance was not a guaranteed event, and so briefly she became a hive of speculation. But the ghost lady's origins go back to the start of RE7's development, and Remy, as she was known for the longest time, was one of the game's earliest designed characters. The concept art sheet for the Bakers has twins and a servant that were cut along the way, but the daughter here is very different to the finished version of Zoe Baker. However, her role was very inconsistent. Remy Baker was the daughter of Jack and Marguerite, an alternative form of the grandmother, and also Evelyn, all at different times. Her role as lead antagonist got steadily altered and diminished as the story took shape. What's wild is by this point in 2015, Remy had already been shown to the world in the VR Kitchen demo. But eventually she found her true purpose as the corrupted wife of the protagonist, and eventually became Mia Winters. All's well that ends well, I guess. Whew. And that's 100. Thanks so much for watching this. It was really fun to put together and also kind of exhausting, frankly. Let us know down below if you know any other rare Resident Evil trivia that I didn't include. I promise I won't steal it. I don't think I have it in me to do another 100. Thanks for watching and have a good week.